In this video, we're going to discuss a few practical applications of KNN and a few ways in which we can decide different designs of the k-nearest neighbor algorithm. So two practical issues that come up when we are applying a k-nearest neighbor algorithm include choosing the right number of neighbors for our problem and choosing the right distance metric. And by number of neighbors, we mean what is actually the number of neighbors based on which we take our decision for each testing sample. And by distance metric, we mean what might be the distance metric that we use to identify which are the closest neighbors to our test sample. And here is an example of an LP norm, which is very frequently used as a distance metric. The above two are called hyperparameters, and the reason why this happens is that these variables are actually being estimated and being predetermined before we run the model and before we train the KNN algorithm. And this means that they are externally set before we actually have the chance to do any type of learning. This is in contrast to the model parameters, which are actually being learned during the learning process. For KNN, we do not have any model parameters because, as we have discussed, KNN is a non-parametric algorithm. What we are going to see in future algorithms, such as the linear perceptron or the logistic regression, that the model parameters are actually being learned from our data, in contrast to the hyperparameters, which are being predetermined. So if we want to decide what are the optimal hyperparameters that will allow us to get a good result for our classifier, and in this specific case for the k-nearest neighbor classifier, we can use a procedure that is called hyperparameter tuning using a validation set. And the validation set is a different set rather than the training or the testing set. And it is being used in order to determine the optimal hyperparameters for our data. So training set, testing set, and validation sets are three different types of sets that are being used in order to train and fine-tune our algorithm. These three sets should not overlap, again, in order to ensure adequate generalizability of our model. So what we can do when we are performing hyperparameter tuning with a validation set is that for each hyperparameter value or a combination of hyperparameter values, we can train our model using our training data. Then we can evaluate the performance of the trained model on the development data. After we have done this for all possible hyperparameter values, then we choose the hyperparameter combination that yields the best performance on the development set, and we use that hyperparameter combination in order to test our algorithm on the test set and provide our final result on the test set. During that process, after we have determined the best hyperparameter, we can also combine the training and the development set together, train our algorithm using both sets with the hyperparameter that has been identified based on the development set, and then evaluate our final model on the test set. If we are to exemplify this for KNN, let's say if we would like to choose what is the optimal K for our data, then this would mean that for all predefined Ks, we would train our model using our training data, and then we would test our model using the development data, and we would evaluate the error rate or the accuracy of each of the K of each number of neighbors on the development set. Now, for the K that we have found to yield the best result on the development set, we use that K, and then we evaluate our data, our test data using that K, and report the result for this test data using the K that has been identified on the development set. Now, while this process is a fairly easy and straightforward process, sometimes, especially when we have a small number of samples, it might be that the samples on the development set are not representative enough of our entire data set. So a way in order to overcome this limitation is to conduct cross-validation. So according to cross-validation, instead of having a separate development set, we split our data into S equal parts. And every time, each part can serve either as a development set or as a training set. How we can do this? Assume that we have a set of data here, as indicated in this figure, that is being split into 5 different parts. And also in this case, we can assume a totally different set of test data that is not being used during the hyperparameter tuning procedure, but is solely being used at the end after we have performed our hyperparameter tuning in order to evaluate our results. So during hyperparameter tuning, we split our data into 5 different sets in this way, and we train our algorithm 5 times for each hyperparameter. So the first time, let's say that we have a given hyperparameter. For the first time, we train our algorithm on all the sets except the first split, and then we test on the first split. The second time, we train our algorithm on all our training data except of the training data that belongs to the second split, and then we test on the second split. We repeat that 5 times, and after we are done with these 5 repetitions, we have an accuracy that has been computed at each run for each of the corresponding split that has been part of the development set at each run. Now we can average the accuracy that has been obtained for each of these, from each of these 5 different runs, and this would be the accuracy that is representative of that specific hyperparameter or of that specific hyperparameter combination. We can repeat this as many times as the predefined hyperparameters that we have for our problem, and then we can find which hyperparameter yields the best average performance as part of this cross-validation. Because we are using the average rather than just the performance on a randomly selected development set, this has higher chances in order to get an accuracy that is more representative of our data. And in this slide, we're just repeating what we said in the previous one using a very simple pseudocode. So after we have split our data into S equal parts, for each hyperparameter value, in this case, for each number of nearest neighbors, we perform this cross-validation and we compute the average accuracy that yields from this cross-validation procedure. As a reminder, as part of this cross-validation procedure, every time that we have split our data into S equal parts, for every split, we evaluate every split as being part of the development set. And then we compute the average that yields from each split. So after we have computed the average for each hyperparameter value, then we choose the hyperparameter that corresponds to the best average performance. And then we use this best hyperparameter to train a model using all our training data, because as part of this procedure, every time we have omitted one specific split from the data. And finally, we evaluate the last model using all the training data and the best hyperparameter that has been identified from the cross-validation. And the evaluation now is being based on the test set. And that result is actually the final result that we are reporting. So another hyperparameter, as we discussed for k-nearest neighbor, is the distance between the test sample with the respective training samples. Previously, we have exemplified KNN using a Euclidean distance, which is the L2 norm, which is the square of the L2 norm, but we can also use alternative distances depending on the structure and the nature of the data. Indicatively here, we present the Manhattan distance or the city block distance, which can be particularly useful if we have nominal and ordinal data, as well as the Hamming distance that can be particularly useful when we had discrete data that does not represent any particular sorting. So in this example, we demonstrate how different distances might result in different sorting between samples. So let's say that we have a set of training data that only includes 2 samples, sample A that belongs to class 1 and sample B that belongs to class 2. And let's say that we want to perform a one nearest neighbor classifier and identify and actually decide which class our test data X belongs to. We are going to run 1NN when we use the Manhattan distance and when we use the Euclidean distance. So when we use the Manhattan distance, we compute the distance between the test sample X from both the training sample A and the training sample D. And we find that the distance between X and A is lower compared to the distance between X and B. Therefore, X is being decided to belong to class 1. However, if we conduct the same procedure using the Euclidean distance, now we see that the Euclidean distance is smaller between sample B and sample X. Therefore, X would belong to class 2 if we use a one nearest neighbor with the Euclidean distance. So again, this goes to demonstrate that different types of distances might have a different effect in the decision-making process, and we need to conduct hyperparameter tuning potentially to identify the distance that would work best for our data. In this example, we would like to demonstrate how different ranges of features might contribute differently to computing the Euclidean distance or computing any other type of distance. So we have 2 specific attributes, one attribute that is being represented by the x-axis, whose range is between 1 and 6, and the second attribute that is being represented on the y-axis, whose range is between 10 and 60. We see that the second attribute has 10 times higher range compared to the first attribute. So what this example will demonstrate is that if we use a Euclidean distance without normalizing our features first, then because the second feature has values that are 10 times higher compared to the first feature, the second feature can actually contribute more to the decision. Because when we compute the Euclidean distance for both features, the corresponding values of the second feature would result in being much higher, just because the second feature has a larger range. So here, when we compute the distance of point P1 with points P2 and P3, and let's say that we use the Euclidean distance, we see that the distance between P1 and P2 is 2,525, and the distance between P1 and P3 is 2,500. So the relative difference with respect to these 2 distances is only 1%, just because point P1 is essentially has the same distance with respect to the y-axis compared to points P2 and P3. And because the y-axis has a feature range that is much higher, this distance between P1 and P2, as well as P1 and P3 with respect to the y-axis, actually contributes the most when we compute the Euclidean distance. However, if we were to see what is the relative shift between points P2 and P3 with respect to the x-axis, this relative shift would be 5 out of 6 units, which corresponds to 83%. So we understand that while the relative change, if we compute the distance between P1 and P2 and P1 and P3 is only 1%, In practice, the relative shift between P2 and P3 with respect to the x-axis is much, much larger. It's actually 83%. So this high relative change with respect to the x-axis is not actually being reflected in the change with respect to the Euclidean distance. So this demonstrates that proximity can change due to change in feature scales, and larger scale features, the features with larger range, tend to inflate the corresponding distance measures. So, of course, a way to address that would be to normalize data. There are various different types of normalizations. In this case, we demonstrate a normalization that corresponds to transforming all our features so that they have a unity standard deviation and zero mean. In this specific question, we have, there is another example on how the distance between the distance that we use for k nearest neighbors matters. And in this example, we have two classes, class 1, which is represented by an asterisk in our data, and class 2, which is represented by a red circle. So class 1 has 3 samples, Y1, Y2, and Y3, and class 2 has 2 samples, Z1 and Z2, as we see in this figure. So we have our test sample X, which is pretty much in the middle of all this, and we would like to conduct a 3 nearest neighbor decision and classify X based on 3 and N using 2 different distance metrics. The first distance metric is this distance metric X1, and the second distance metric is this distance metric X2. So the question is, if we use each of these 2 distance metric, what would be the decision that we will get for sample X, given our 5 training data, Y1, Y2, Y3, Z1, and Z2. So we will express these distances D1 and D2 in a better form. So from the matrix vector notation, we're going to transform these distances into an analytical form just to better understand what is going on. So if we express D1 in an analytical form, that would just be the Euclidean distance between 2 points. If we express D2, that would be a modified version of the Euclidean distance, where the second dimension, the y-axis essentially, would have less weight, would actually have less weight in how it contributes to the distance. And specifically, the y-axis would contribute 3 times less to the distance D2 compared to the x-axis. So intuitively, what we understand by this is that if we have this sample X here, if we use D2, then artificially D2 would bring samples Y1, Y2, and Y3 closer to X, just because D2 tends to underestimate the distance with respect to these samples on the y-axis, while D1 would actually represent both x and y-axis, the distances with respect to both x and y-axis at the same portion. So intuitively, we would understand that it would be most probable that if we are to use D1, then that distance would capture this circle, and then we would have to expand our circle in order to find what are the first 3 samples that actually belong to this circle, and based on the class of these first 3 samples, we would get a decision for D1. Now we see that based on D1, the closest 3 samples are Z1, Z2, and Y2. Z1 and Z2 belong to class 2, which is the majority class in this 3 sample voting procedure. Therefore, sample X would actually belong to class 2 according to D1. Now, if we are to do the same thing for distance D2, again, distance D2 has the y-axis to contribute less to the overall decision. So what this means is that according to D2, samples Y1, Y2, and Y3 would be closest to X, just because instead of using this a circle in order to find the 3 nearest neighbors, we would have to use this ellipse, whose vertical axis is 3 times larger compared to the corresponding horizontal axis. So if we are to do that, then we would find that samples Y1, Y2, and Y3 would be the first 3 that go inside that ellipse. All of these samples belong to class 1. Therefore, test sample X would be classified as class 1 according to distance D2. Therefore, the right answer in this multiple choice question is answer D. If you would like to do that in a numerical, to solve that example in a numerical form, you could actually go ahead and compute distances D1 and D2 between test sample X and all the training samples. And these distances are being denoted in this table. So you would find exactly the same thing. So according to distance D1, the samples that have the closest distance to X are Y2, Z1, and Z2. And according to distance D2, the samples that are closest to X are Y1, Y2, and Y3. So finally, we haven't discussed what can someone do in the case of a tie where we have a KNN classifier and when we are taking a majority vote in order to decide the class in which our test samples belongs to. So if we have a tie, there are several possibilities that we can follow. The first possibility would be to randomly assign a class to our test sample. The second option would be to assign the class with the highest frequency in the training set, just because these might all actually have the highest chance of being correct if the training set is representative of our actual data. Another option would be to classify the test sample according to K-1 or K+1 nearest neighbor, and that would break the tie if we just include or exclude one training sample from the decision-making process. And finally, another option would be to follow a modified version of KNN, which we will refer to as weighted KNN, and then weight each vote according to its distance from the test sample. And this is very likely to break the tie, since now we are not going to have to deal with integers, but we will have to deal with continuous numbers. So that concludes the second part of KNN that describes the practical applications. And in the third part, we're going to see some of the modified versions of KNN.